everyone, and thank you for listening to Information Week's podcast. I'm your host, Emily Johnson, Information Week's digital content editor. Joining us today is Joe Emison, Chief Information Officer at Xceligent and the founder of BuildFacts. Joe also works as a consultant helping companies migrate to the cloud. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Glad you're here. So Information Week and our sister event, Interop ITX, recently conducted a survey of IT pros on the state of the cloud computing. Joe, being the content expert that he is, reviewed the findings and wrote a great report for us on the major trends in cloud computing, highlighting developments such as the shift away from private cloud. That's what we'll be discussing today. Okay, let's get started. Joe, our 2017 State of the Cloud survey found that the usage of private cloud has been in a steady decline over the last 4 years, while infrastructure as a service nearly doubled. What reasons do you see going on behind these trends?
Well, I think that private cloud is difficult and it's a pain. One of the reasons why Amazon Web Services in particular has taken so much market share, and now we see Google and Microsoft doing a good job in the space as well, is that it's not just PI-driven virtual machines. So I think a lot of people looked at Amazon and, say, compared it to VMware and said, oh, I get it. With VMware, there's a lot of manual work where humans are setting up virtual machines. And so Amazon's doing it by API, so you can automate the whole thing, infrastructure as code. And then they said, well, we can do this in a private cloud, and then it'll have all the benefits of the private cloud or putative benefits around security and things like that. But I think people have found out that, in fact, that is not even the primary value potentially that Amazon is offering. Actually dealing with all the hardware and all the software you need to handle the controlling of the hardware is just such that private clouds are a pain. We've administered several private clouds over the past 6 years, and we've shut them all down in favor of public infrastructure as a service, because it when you actually take into account all of the costs, public cloud is just better. It's cheaper, and it allows you to focus on what you need in your business instead of worrying about capacity planning and touching and feeling hardware.
Okay. And then you also touch on hybrid clouds in the report. Why haven't they been successful yet? And do you have any examples that you can share from your own experience?
Sure. Well, one is hybrid cloud is only a good idea in the mind of, I think, consultants and theorists. Anyone who's actually done a hybrid cloud can tell you, especially in production, can tell you that they're horrible things. There are two essential problems with any hybrid cloud. One of them is that, in general, if you're going to connect a public cloud to some sort of private cloud or private infrastructure, they're going to be different. They'll probably different APIs and have a lot of differences. Unless you're thinking about them purely as sort of manual-driven virtual machines, when you actually get to cloud automation and orchestration, they're different. And that adds a lot of complexity and pain. Another big problem, though, is network latency. And one of the examples people love to give of hybrid cloud is cloud bursting. And it's sort of an open joke amongst anybody who actually administers clouds that cloud bursting is a thing. And you might have read about this maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. The idea was, oh, you know what public cloud is going to be great for? On Black Friday, when we have, or Cyber Monday, when we have so many more visitors to our website, we're just going to spin up a few servers in the cloud, and that'll handle all those excess traffic. And that's a great idea if you're non-technical and don't know anything about administering servers. The problem is that you're going to have to bridge those machines across the network. The network latency is going to be very painful to your database, so the connection is going to be very slow. It's going to be hard to establish them and set them up properly. And the network connections are not going to be reliable, and you're going to have all sorts of debugging pains. And all of that costs far, far more than just sticking everything in the public cloud or the private cloud. So, and again, I've administered only one hybrid cloud, thankfully, and quickly realized that it was a terrible idea. And so I think that, if I had to choose between a private cloud and a hybrid cloud, I'd definitely choose a private cloud because at least I've reduced some of the complexity.
Gotcha. Okay, the survey findings showed that cloud management was still an unsolved issue in 2016. What are you hoping to see from the cloud management solutions market in 2017 to help us inch closer to an effective tool?
I think things need to be a lot simpler. The simple things, like Elastic Beanstalk is an example of one of Amazon's. And Amazon has something like 4 different cloud orchestration automation management tools at this point. They have Beanstalk and CloudFormation and OpsWorks and Simple Workflow Service, and sort of had a couple of new ones recently at reInvent. And Elastic Beanstalk is nice and simple, but just can't do a lot of what people want to do. And then I think the systems that most like top cloud architects are picking today would be in the more traditional space, SaltStack and HashiCorp's Terraform. And then also we're seeing increased interest in Kubernetes, although it's not exactly the same thing. And all of these things are relatively complicated. I mean, I would say that SaltStack and Terraform are the least complicated of them that allow you to do lots of things. But everything's a bit complicated, and so what I'd like to see is some simpler services out there. And in fact, we're starting to see a number of startups in this space where there are companies who are trying to make it so you just sort of go onto their site and you can very easily describe what you need and point to your code and just click a button and it'll establish an infrastructure for you. And so I think that's where things will go, and hopefully we'll see some good startups in 2017 in this space.
Did you see containers emerge as an alternative to cloud management tools this past year?
There's certainly a lot of interest in experimentation. I would say there are far more, let's say, opinionated blog posts out there talking about people's frustration with something like Docker than with happiness. And people who are using Docker in production tend to have some significant caveats around how you think about it and how you use it. There's a lot of complexity you get with Docker. There are a lot of annoyances in terms of intra-version compatibility, and I think a lot of challenges. And again, I just want to emphasize, it's not super simple. So I think a lot of people who aren't using containers read some articles about them and think, wow, yeah, that sounds great. I think we should do that. Or programmers who do a little bit with Docker and go, wow, this seems great. But it ends up being pretty complicated. And at this point, I don't know many cloud architects who are really, it's got to be containers or nothing else. I mean, a lot certainly use them, but you got a lot of others who just stick with the VM as a container. And especially if you're using public cloud, there begins to be less of a reason for using containers, especially if you're on Amazon, because Amazon's Elastic Container Service isn't viewed to be all that great. I think Google's is viewed to be better, but even still, you've got a lot of people who know them both well and opt out of containers. So I would say there's an aspect of containers today being like how we might have thought of platform as a service 2 or 3 years ago, that it seems like it should be something that would be great and powerful and we would all be moving to, but we don't actually see that happening.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And then from the report, functions as a service or serviceful architectures. Those are new terms to me, and I'm guessing to some of our listeners as well. Are those cloud applications or something different?
Yeah, so these are both under the category of serverless. And I think a lot of people hate the name serverless because obviously they're still servers. And there are a lot of people who equate serverless with a service from Amazon called Lambda. And I would just call that functions as a service. So let me give you some definitions here. From my perspective, serverless is an idea that you don't need emergency operations anymore. So one of the things that is great about a traditional public cloud deployment where you're renting VMs by the hour is that you don't need to worry about the hardware, and if the hardware fails, you can go get another VM. However, that doesn't solve all of your problems. And in fact, if one of your VMs dies, it's your responsibility to bring it back up. And you can contrast this with a service like Amazon's S3, for example, which is an object storage or like a file storage service where you can just stick a bunch of files and it's always up. And Amazon is completely responsible for keeping S3 up. In fact, if you can't get to S3, it's almost certainly your fault. It's a problem on your end. It has nothing to do with the service. The service just stays up. It has an absolutely amazing amount of uptime. And that's great. It means you can go from having systems administrators and network administrators and all sorts and downtime to completely handing that over to Amazon as a form of utility computing, and Amazon just handled that. So, or in that case, it's utility storage. So the idea behind serverless is, can you take the programs you've written and do the same thing? Can you give Amazon your code, let's say, or Google and Microsoft have similar things, as does IBM. Basically, everyone is coming out with copies of Lambda. How do you hand your code over so that somebody else runs it for you and they worry about the uptime so that it doesn't go down and it's just always up? And then again, you don't need emergency operations people. You don't need a network operations center that's monitoring your service's uptime because it's just going to work and it scales out magically. This, in theory, is a good idea, and it's got a lot of promise. It does, however, have some of the same problems, but potentially worse, that the idea that you need to re-architect your applications to be cloud native to move them onto Amazon so that they can handle the sort of different hardware environment. In the same way, you have to further re-architect your applications for the traditional sort of serverless Lambda functions as a service framework. And that means you have to rewrite your application as a series of completely isolated functions that can call each other. And it's hard to debug Lambda. It's hard to deploy to Lambda. It's very early, and this is true in some of these other services as well. Probably the easiest one to use is one called WebTask from a company called Auth0. In the set of deploying code and running them, this is more it has promise. However, I think there's another side of the serverless movement, which is service-full architectures. And this is where, when you're writing an application, you just use a lot of services to handle pieces of your application. So, for example, Twilio is a company that just had a really big IPO, and they offer telephony. So if you want to write an IVR or you want to send SMS text messages from your application, you can just hook up to their service. Their service essentially becomes a part of your application, and you just make calls to it to go send messages, receive messages, answer phone calls, all of those things. You don't have to write that code anymore. And we're starting to get a lot of these services, like basically anything you'd ever want to do with an image can be done by a service called Cloudinary. Almost anything you'd like to do with search and search indexing, search as a service, can be done by a service called Algolia. Almost anything that you want with authentication or single sign-on, SAML, can be done by a service called Auth0. And all of these mean that the actual amount of code you have to write for your applications is pretty small. It means that you can have all your code run in an app or on the client side and just talk to all these services. And it has the same benefit of not needing emergency operations. So I think in the report we have a lot of good links there, and that would give you more details. But that's a summary of serviceful and functions as a service.
And a very thorough summary. Thank you for that. Finally, are there other developments in the cloud that you see taking shape as we approach Interop ITX in May?
What I hope that the future holds is one. I think we're getting a better and better understanding that the reason why we love and businesses love the cloud is that it makes businesses function better. It makes businesses able to develop software more effectively, and because software is eating the world, a lot of businesses' growth is really based upon their ability to deliver software more effectively. And so I think we're seeing cloud vendors focus on that. I think you see a lot in Amazon, like in reInvent, a lot of focus on how do we help you deploy your code and run your code in better ways. And I think that's critically important. So I think we're seeing a lot more of that focus, which is great. The focus on the developer and the benefits to developers and software development. And then the other trend that we're seeing a little of, but I'm a little less hopeful for, is making things easier. If you haven't spent a lot of time with Amazon Web Services and you go to Amazon Web Services and you try to read some of the tutorials, and you find them confusing and very complicated, that's not you. They are. It's way more complicated than it needs to be. And in many cases, you have to do a lot of work for something that's really simple. And I think that's an area that Google is somewhat effectively attacking Amazon on, although not all the way. And Microsoft also, I think, sees this, especially if you're familiar with the Microsoft stack and Microsoft environments. But I hope that, and I know that whoever is going to be wildly successful in the space is going to make it very, very simple.
Joe, this has been very informative. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the cloud. For our listeners, you can also hear Joe speak at Interop ITX in May. To read the full Information Week and Interop ITX 2017 State of the Cloud report, check out the link in my blog on InformationWeek.com. Interop ITX, the only independent event for tech leaders, is offering the listeners of this podcast a special discount on passes to the conference and expo held at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas in May. Save 20% on the current price of all passes with promo code IWPodcast. To learn more about ITX, Interop ITX, or to register for the event, visit interop.com. Thank you all again for listening, and be sure to catch more IT community news, podcasts, and commentary at InformationWeek.com.